For years, the world believed they knew the Whitfields, the picture-perfect American family with 8 bright, matching outfitted children, a mother who ran the household like a general, and a reality show that made them into household names. But behind the smiles, the choreographed family dinners, and the pastel-colored playroom walls, something much darker was quietly unfolding. Emery Whitfield, once the quietest of the 8, has grown up, and she is done staying silent. Her account of her childhood is far more complicated than anything the cameras ever showed, and what she has to say about her mother has left longtime viewers of the show heartbroken. Before Emery Whitfield could walk, her life already belonged to an audience. Born in a small Ohio hospital in the spring of 2003, she arrived into a world that had been engineered around her before she'd taken her first breath. A production schedule, a network contract, a brand. She was one of 6 children born in a single, headline-making delivery. Emery, her twin brother Dashiell, and 4 more siblings who arrived in the same astonishing hour, joined by 2 older sisters from her parents' first years of marriage. When the Whitfield house premiered on a cable network in 2006, it was sold to the public as a warm, funny portrait of 2 overwhelmed but loving parents making it work. Audiences adored the mother's blunt, no-nonsense parenting style and the father's easy humor. They tuned in every week to watch chaos become charm. But for Emery, who was barely old enough to talk when filming began, that perfect family was never something she lived. It was something she performed. What most viewers never clocked was that the Whitfield home had quietly stopped being a home at all. It had become a set. Cameras were mounted in nearly every room. The kitchen, the playroom, even the hallway outside the bedrooms, capturing breakfast, meltdowns, punishments, everything. Emery's laughter was content. Her tears were content. Even the way she was disciplined became part of a storyline that a stranger in another state would watch with a bowl of popcorn on a Tuesday night. We're all representatives of the brand, her mother, Vivian, used to say, often right before the cameras rolled. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't just a family anymore. It was a business, and every smile had a dollar value attached to it. For Emery, childhood didn't happen behind closed doors. It happened in front of a live studio audience that never left. Behind the cheerful narration and the tidy editing, the fractures were already forming. Emery, sensitive, watchful, quick to absorb the emotional temperature of a room, struggled under the rigid control that defined her mother's house. Vivian ran the household on a minute-by-minute schedule, meals timed, outfits coordinated, obedience expected without negotiation. On camera, it read as impressive, even aspirational. To Emery, it felt like living inside a machine that never powered down. Longtime viewers, watching closely over the seasons, began to notice something the show never named directly. How often Emery seemed to shrink during arguments, how quickly she learned to make her face go still and unreadable the moment a disagreement started. Privacy didn't exist in that house. Even the worst days were captured for an audience of millions. Emery would later describe that stretch of her childhood as ordered chaos, a place where how things looked always outranked how anyone actually felt. What the cameras never showed was the exhaustion underneath it. The pressure to look happy, constantly, even on the days she wasn't. While kids her age were out being loud and unfiltered, Emery was learning to fold her feelings into something small enough not to threaten the family image. By the time the show hit its ratings peak, the Whitfields were everywhere. Talk shows, magazine covers, tabloid write-ups. The world loved them. But at home, the foundation was cracking. Her parents' marriage, already strained by the demands of fame, collapsed publicly a few years later. The show rebranded around the mother alone. The magic that once made it must-watch television quietly drained out of every episode. Emery, still a young child, was already absorbing the emotional cost of a life she never chose. For years, the Whitfields looked like the ideal modern family. 8 kids, 2 committed parents, a house full of noise and love. But once the crew packed up their equipment and the lights went dark, a very different version of that house came into focus. Even as a child, Emery could sense the gap between what audiences believed and what was actually happening inside those walls. Her mother, worn down by the pressure of fame and the sheer logistics of raising 8 kids under a camera's gaze, developed what those close to the family described as an unyielding, almost militant parenting style. Rules weren't just rules, they were absolute. Mistakes weren't lessons, they were failures. On television, it read as efficient. In the house, it felt like walking on a floor that could give out at any moment. Every hour of every day had a shape to it. Wake-up time, meal times, outfit choices, even instructions on how to smile convincingly for a camera crew that was always somewhere nearby. We weren't really living. Emery said years later, in the quiet, measured way she talks about most of her childhood. We were performing it. The full weight of what had happened in that house didn't come into focus for most people until Emery finally spoke about her younger brother, Reese. In a long-form interview years after the show ended, Emery, calm, deliberate, clearly having rehearsed this moment in her head many times before saying it out loud, described a part of her childhood that had never made it to air. Her brother, she said, had effectively disappeared from the family's daily life. He didn't play outside with the rest of them. He ate his meals alone, on a different schedule. For a long stretch of her childhood, Reese was there, but not there, present in the house, absent from her memories. Emery described her mother keeping Reese in a separate room for long stretches, a space the family never spoke about openly. He would spend hours there by himself, with no real explanation given to his siblings about why. Years later, Reese spoke publicly himself, confirming what his sister had described. He talked about a locked door, about being watched through a camera mounted in the corner of that room, about long stretches of silence and isolation that no child should have to sit inside of. Their mother, when the allegations became public, defended her choices, saying Reese had significant behavioral needs and that she had been following professional guidance the whole time. But the picture she painted, a stretched-thin mother doing her best with expert advice, never quite lined up with what her own children remembered living through. Emery's account made one thing clear in her own mind. Her brother wasn't a troubled kid who needed managing. He was a child who had been quietly written out of his own family's story. And his absence from their day-to-day life wasn't really about health. It felt, to her, like punishment. For Emery, this was never really about assigning blame publicly. It was about fear, the specific, disorienting fear of watching a sibling vanish from your daily life and not having the words, or the courage, to ask why. There was always something missing, she said. We weren't 8 anymore, even when the cameras said we were. Even as production continued, Reese became a kind of ghost in his own family story, edited out of birthdays, absent from group shots, never quite mentioned on air. Emery, far too young at the time to say anything, carried the quiet guilt of a child who noticed everything and could change nothing. Fans who had once held Vivian up as a symbol of scrappy, no excuses parenting started asking harder questions. Could someone capable of inspiring so many exhausted parents also be capable of causing this kind of harm to her own child? Emery's account, offered without anger, suggested the uncomfortable answer might be yes. The tension between Emery and her mother didn't erupt. It built, quietly, for years, the way pressure builds behind a wall before anyone notices the crack. By the time she was 14, Emery had reached a point where something had to give. After nearly a decade under her mother's roof and her mother's rules, she made the decision to go live with her father, Marcus. It wasn't simple. Vivian had been awarded primary custody of all 8 kids after the couple's divorce years earlier, while Marcus had spent that same stretch being cast, fairly or not, as the less stable parent in the public narrative. But Emery had come to see something different in her father's house, the possibility of quiet. Marcus, who'd spent years feeling shut out of his kids' day-to-day lives, noticed how anxious Emery seemed every time she visited, and how visibly she relaxed the longer she stayed. Her visits got longer. Then one day, she simply told him she didn't want to go back. He later said her decision to speak up for herself was what finally pushed him to fight for custody at all. She was brave, he said. She just wanted a normal life. After a quiet legal process, Marcus was granted full custody. Not long after, Reese came to live with them too, once he was finally out of the facility he'd been placed in years earlier. For the first time, 2 of the 8 Whitfield kids were living outside their mother's control. That freedom came with a cost. Emery's relationship with the siblings who stayed behind grew distant. Visits became rare, then awkward, then almost non-existent. The family that had once been inseparable on camera was now quietly split. Some kids with their mother, some with their father, a divide that tabloids loved to frame as another chapter in an ongoing family feud. For Emery, it was simpler than that. It was survival. She has described her life since then, plainly, as normal, a word that, for her, carries enormous weight. After years of filming schedules and color-coded discipline charts, she finally had room to just exist, to breathe, to feel safe without an audience. For all the headlines about custody battles and family estrangement, Emery has never turned her story into a campaign against her mother. Her tone, even in interviews about the hardest parts of her childhood, has stayed measured, emotional, but controlled, like someone who has spent a long time thinking about exactly how much to say and how to say it. "My mom wasn't perfect," she once said. No parent is. It's a simple sentence, but it holds a lot. A mix of real pain and real compassion that maybe only someone who grew up as public property could fully understand. While some of her siblings have chosen to stay quiet about their childhood, Emery has slowly started talking about what it actually felt like to grow up under that level of pressure. How every argument, every outfit, every birthday party had to serve the brand before it could just be a family moment. She followed those rules for years. It wasn't until she moved in with her father that she understood how different life could look without them. "I can finally just be myself," she said in one interview. "I'm not representing anyone anymore." Her father has described his house as the place where Emery finally got to heal. No cameras, no rigid schedules, no constant tension humming under every conversation. For the first time, she had privacy. She could have friends over. She could mess up without it becoming a plot point. She could just be a teenager. But even as she rebuilt her own life, she never stopped thinking about her siblings. "They're part of me in a way nobody else can really understand," she said. She stayed closest with one sister in particular, and even with all the distance and unresolved tension, she's held on to the hope that someday the family might find its way back to each other, without a camera crew documenting the reunion. If Emery's account cracked the door open, her brother Reese kicked it the rest of the way. In a series of interviews, he laid out disturbing specifics about what his childhood had actually looked like, describing abuse that he said started when he was around 8 years old, saying he was singled out and punished far more harshly than his siblings, isolated for reasons that were never really explained to him. His delivery was calm, almost eerily so, which somehow made what he was describing land even harder. He talked about a room built with monitoring equipment inside it, a lock on the outside of the door. After his account went public, the family was thrown into a new round of turmoil. Vivian responded with a public statement saying her son had received multiple psychiatric diagnoses and that everything she'd done had been under professional supervision. One of the older daughters publicly sided with their mother, describing Reese as having a history of violent behavior. Meanwhile, their father's longtime partner spoke up in Reese's defense, describing him as a fundamentally kind person and calling the accusations against his character false. Caught in the middle of all of it was Emery, pulled between loyalty, her own memory of events, and sheer exhaustion at watching her family fight this out in public. She didn't join the public back and forth. She kept her own words careful and few. Eventually, she shared that she'd started slowly reconnecting with her mother after years of distance. "We talk about school, life, normal stuff," she said. "She's my mom." It was a short statement, but it carried a lot, something close to the beginning of forgiveness, even if it wasn't the whole thing yet. Today, Emery has